Good evening. Welcome to the Lessons of Vietnam show. And I'll go ahead and go to the first slide. There you go. The Lessons of Vietnam show will try to tell the real story of the Vietnam War and the men and women who served in it. There's so many myths and half-truths out there. I'm your host, Bill Dixon, Vietnam veteran, 67, 68. Let's see, 2009, 2012, and 2014. Been back 3 times. We're broadcast courtesy of Nissan Communications Worldwide Headquarters here in Raleigh, North Carolina. If you have any comments and suggestions, you can reach out to me at Bill Dixon at DixonBill80. Don't forget that 80 at yahoo.com. Now, we'd like for you to participate in the show any way that you would like. You can call us at 919-518-9773, or even better, go on to Skype, and it's Computers 2K Voice. Computers 2K Voice, and you can be join in, ask questions, make comments, or whatever. This is a tough time with everybody being locked up and having to stay home and so forth, and it gets a little bit more pressure sometimes on some of the veterans. I know that I have a group call now through online and talking to some of the other veterans and so forth. Some of us are struggling a little bit. But if you know a veteran, or you're a veteran, or you're part of a veteran's family or whatever, reach out to this Veterans Crisis Line, 1-800-273-8255. Press 1. There's somebody there wanting to talk to you and help you through it and so forth. Don't be too proud to reach out, get the phone, make a call, and you'll be surprised at how much better you feel afterwards. Next slide, please, sir. Tonight's show is the tanks of the Vietnam War. That tank happens to be at Cu Chi, or the tunnels of Cu Chi now. That was one of the American tanks that was, I'm certain it was destroyed and probably brought into sight there. It may have been there, but that's where the tunnels are at Cu Chi. But that's an American tank. I can't tell you what kind. I'm certain some tank folks out there could probably tell me exactly what kind, and I can't read the little sign above it, so we're just going to know it's an American tank. What brand, I'm not certain. A lot of people didn't even know there were such things in tanks in Vietnam, because you think of jungles and swamps and all that sort of stuff, and they did have their challenges, what I'll start with, but they were there, all kinds of different tanks. And some other track vehicles we're going to be talking about as the show goes on. And let's see the next one, Amnon, if you would, please, sir. Originally, the Marines landed at a place called Red Beach, which is just outside of Da Nang, the city of Da Nang, which is a beautiful city, by the way. There is the Marines landing, coming ashore. If you'll notice in the picture on your right, where they're pushing something up the bank there, there are a lot of civilians standing there. The Vietnamese had high school students and everything else to greet the Marines there, putting the flower lays around some of the Marines' neck, welcome them to Vietnam. The first American military ground force to arrive in South Vietnam was the 9th Marine Expeditionary Brigade, which waited ashore near the coastal city of Da Nang on 8th of March, 1965. The next day, they brought ashore a platoon of 5 M48 Patton Tanks belonging to the 3rd Tank Battalion. It took until July 1965 before the battalion's entire inventory of tanks was ashore in Vietnam. Now, the reason that they brought those in was actually the powers that be in Vietnam, the Americans, Westmoreland, and some of the other people just did not think themselves that Vietnam was the type of place that tanks would be useful and so forth, but it was proven that they did have a place. Next slide, please, sir. The first major combat encounter in South Vietnam that involved American tanks occurred in August 1965, when Marine Corps armor went up against enemy defensive positions in Operation Starlite and inflicted heavy losses on the Viet Cong troops, manning them, and with some losses to themselves. And that's a book by Otto Barak. Operation Starlite, the beginning of the blood in Vietnam. It's about the tanks and so forth. So in August 1965 was the first time the Marines used their tanks, and kind of proved that tanks had a place. Next slide, please. If you haven't quite figured it out yet, I'm in one place in Raleigh, and Amnon in the studio is another place in Raleigh. So we're practicing distance show ourselves here. The deployment of the Marine Corps 3rd Tank Battalion was against the wishes of the United States ambassadors to South Vietnam and the Military Assistance Command, or MACV as we call it, in Vietnam, who felt that tanks were not suitable for the terrain and the counterinsurgency warfare taking place, and would place an undue strain on the logistical support system, which means basically is getting ammunition for the tanks. You got to have gas for the tanks. They do break down, so you got to have people there. So they didn't think that the situation there and the terrain and so forth in Vietnam would accept tanks. With this thought in mind, U.S. Army Ground Force combat units that arrived in South Vietnam in 1965 had mostly been stripped of their tank battalions before arriving in country. So when the Army came, they didn't bring tanks with them really, but the Marines did bring them when they first came. And we already know that the tank did a good job. At the same time, however, American units began encountering not just enemy guerrilla units. Those are the guerrilla units we think of as the VC, the little guys in black pajamas, or as it says here, referred to as the Viet Cong or VC, primarily using hit and run tactics. But main force North Vietnamese Army, NVA, units that often employed conventional tactics when the opportunity presented itself. And you can see some of the NVA there. They had uniforms, they had weapons, very similar to our own weapons, except they used the AK-47s, we used the 14 and 16. The appearance of the main force NVA units in South Vietnam helped overcome the resistance of many senior leadership in the United States Army, who initially felt there was no place for tanks in the battle for Southeast Asia. So we're not just fighting the farmer by day and guerrilla fighter at night. We were fighting regular trained NVA forces have been fighting for a long time. So we actually were fighting two different groups. As you can see, tanks could cross the river. We had some amphibious tanks we're talking about. U.S. Army Ground Forces units that began arriving in South Vietnam in 1966 came with a full complement of M48 A3 Patton tanks. I'm going to start placing the word Patton instead of the M48 A3 because obviously I'm having a hard time saying that for some strange reason. The successful combat use of these vehicles in various battles that took place between 1966 and 1967 convinced many of the non-believers that was indeed a valuable place on the battlefields of Southeast Asia for tanks, despite various terrain obstacles such as jungles and often less than optimum weather conditions. And you can see it seems to be getting across that river pretty good with the kids standing on it. The primary tank of the used in Vietnam was the M48 or Patton tank. The M48 A3 model B, as you see there, Patton tank. They had different configurations of different tanks. That is the medium tank with a gasoline engine. That is the A2C. You see the big thing there right behind the barrel as you hits the body. That is a searchlight. I always wondered every time I saw that going, yeah, you can see the enemy real good with that light, but they can see you pretty good. Now the tanks were set up in different ways, had different nomenclatures. Some of them were set up with certain different guns. Some of them were flamethrowers and so forth, which we'll discuss as we go through. But that's the medium tank. Now this one is the 67A2 Patton flame tank, and it's only used by the U.S. Marines and had a 3-man crew, where most of the tanks had a 4-man crew, and sometimes the nomenclature was about how many wheels you see on it there. But that was a flamethrowing tank, okay? The M48 Patton tank. The first Chrysler production tank was unveiled on 1 July 1952 as the 9mm gun tank M48 and christened the M48 Patton by his Mrs. Beatrice Ayres Patton, wife of the late General George S. Patton. Chrysler began in 1951 to produce the M48, while Chrysler Defense Engineering and Arco continued advanced production engineering to involve the design using the T-48 prototypes at the Detroit Arsenal. You'll see as we go through, we sent a tank over and said, you know, that would be great, but what if we did this to it? And they would have different nomenclatures most of the time. In May of 1952, Chrysler came to an agreement to take control on a government-owned and contractor-operated basis with the United States government and to continue production design refinements of the T-48 at the Detroit Arsenal. What that means is that the Chrysler is going to build it, but the overall is owned by the company, but run by Chrysler Corporation, okay? To meet the urgent need for tank production, contracts were also awarded to General Motors, Fisher Body Division, and Ford Motor Company to produce the tanks in Michigan starting in 1952. Also in July of 1952, the Army awarded American Locomotive Company a $200 million contract to start producing the tank in 1953 at the Schenectady tank plant in New York. Now you've got all these different companies making the same tank, which means automatically that they ain't all going to be the same. All four companies were given initial production contracts in the same year for around 400 tanks each. That's a lot of tanks rolling off. The M48 featured a gasoline-powered engine. Different models were used depending on availability and manufacturer. Additionally, a two-cylinder gasoline air-cooled engine, sometimes referred to as a Little Joe by tank crews, was provided to provide a power to a 28-volt, 300-amp generator when the main engine was not needed. So they didn't have to sit there and burn all that gas. They could sit there and have lights and power and so forth by the generator. Fuel capacity was 200 US gallons, providing a cruising range of about 70 miles. After about 65 miles, they start looking for a gas station real close or truck. The usefulness of the Patton tank and the other American armored fighting vehicles was proven again during the January-February 1968 surprise Tet Offensive, in which the VC and NVA moved out of their countryside areas and struck at the urban population centers of South Vietnam and various large American military bases. I know because I was at Long Binh when we got attacked, and also I was in Saigon shortly after that. It was American tanks and other mechanized vehicles that were able to respond to the enemy's offensive in a timely manner with their mobility, which disrupted many of the enemy's attack plans. But that's a tank, Patton tank coming down the streets of Saigon there. Okay. Next slide. Okay, and you also, they're really good for hiding behind. In the urban fighting that took place during the Tet Offensive, it was the firepower of the M114 90mm main gun mounted on the M48A3 Patton tanks that often rooted out the VC and NVA from their urban strongholds. Now you see that barrel is a little shorter than the other barrel we looked at. When the VC or NVA attempted to retreat from the cities of South Vietnam after their surprise offensive failed, it was American tanks that helped chase them back to their countryside bases camps. And as you can see, as the tank's moving along, the soldiers are knelt down beside so they could protect the tank, and it's also move forward and take space. That picture is probably from Hue, and during the Battle of Hue, the Marines had to fight door to door, and it may take them a day or two to get 100 yards. That's how intense it was sometimes, okay? Sometime after 1968 Tet Offensive, a shortage of M48A3 Patton tanks caused the United States Army to ship an unknown number of Pattons tanks to South Vietnam. In other words, they don't have any idea quite certain how many they sent. They just sent everything they could get, and there's some of the tanks coming into Vietnam. And why was there a shortage? Because during the Battle of Tet Offensive, all the uprisings going across the country, there was a lot of tanks that were getting damaged, some destroyed. and some just need repairs. And tank, that's my tank there. That's my service dog, and he's heard somebody he wanted to check on. But just try to pay him no attention. I'll make him leave the room if he keeps that up. So he's not been a good boy. Okay, the only time American M48A3 tanks or Patton tanks actually engaged in face-to-face combat with NVA armor during the Vietnam War occurred on the early evening of 3 March 1969 at the Ben Het Special Forces Camp, located in the mountains of South Vietnam's Central Highlands. Now, you would think with all the tanks over there, there'd have been more of that, but not too many times that the communists let their tanks come across the DMZ. They wanted to make sure that they kept them back where they were safe. The NVA attacked the base with a number of Soviet-supplied P-76 amphibious light tanks and at least one BTR-50 amphibious armored personnel carrier, APC. Now, the top picture you see there is the P-76 amphibious light tank. And then down below that is the armored personnel carrier, the BTR-50 Russian personnel carrier. Unknown to the NVA tankers, there was a platoon of Patton tanks guarding the base and ensuring engagement. The NVA lost 2 P-76s and a PT-50. The American tankers suffered 2 killed and slight damage to a single Patton tank. When it says 2 killed, I think it was talking about 2 individuals, not 2 tanks. Okay, next slide, please. American Patton tanks were employed in a variety of roles during their tour during the Vietnam War. One of the best known was referred to as search and destroy. Almost all of us have heard of that. These search and destroy operations were intended to locate enemy installations, attract VC and NVA forces, and to destroy or remove the opponent's supplies and equipment. Less importance was given to seizing and holding critical terrain than to finding and finishing off the enemy. In other words, we didn't hold space. We would take it and then leave, and we did not normally hold the land. You can see the tanks there. You can see one sit in. If you look on there, you see a canopy out the side where the guys there are sitting in the shade, what little shade they could get with that canopy, and the guy up on top of the tank is keeping watch out and so forth. But that's the search and destroy missions they went on, okay? When enemy units were located, they were attacked by a combination of maneuvering and blocking elements, both supported by artillery and aircraft. During many search and destroy operations, armor units, especially cavalry elements, were initially engaged in an area reconnaissance and intelligence gathering. When contact was made, they then undertook offensive operations in what the American military described as a meeting engagement. So you can see the soldiers dismounted there, probably calling in some of the tanks right there on the spot. So next slide, please. Many search and destroy operations began with dismounted infantry deployed as skirmishers to conduct a detailed hole by hole and bush by bush search with the Patton tanks positioned well back. In other words, they would send the infantry guys out to find them. You can see them there checking out one of the tunnels that were scattered around throughout Vietnam what the communists had, but they would send them out when they found them, then they would bring up the tanks. The dismounted infantry would seldom have the firepower needed to overcome the enemy at the point of contact. The tanks were then committed to the assault in order to destroy the enemy units. In other words, usually, excuse me, sorry about that. I lost my voice there for a second. Usually there was not enough, the enemy wouldn't normally attack or be attacked unless they had outnumbered the troops. So that kind of kept them on site. A variation of this same mission would find the tanks leading the way, with dismounted infantry following to protect the tanks from enemy anti-attack teams. In jungles and heavily overgrown areas, the Patton tanks were employed to break pathways for dismounted infantry, detonate anti-personnel mines, and support the dismounted infantry by firing on enemy defensive work and crew-served weapons. So sometimes the tanks would go first, and sometimes the troops would go first. It all depended on just what they needed to be done. Again. The combat engagement ranges that occurred during search and destroy operations between Patton tanks and their opponents were generally under 328 yards. However, engagements at 16 to 27 yards were not uncommon, especially in areas of dense vegetation. 16 yards is pretty close, but if you're going through the jungle, if you're going through the elephant grass, you couldn't see much farther than that anyway. Next slide. The most commonly employed main gun round M48 A3s or Patton tanks used during search and destroy operations was called canisters. The canister round was designed solely for use against enemy personnel at relatively short range, kind of like a shotgun shell. The casing of the projectile split as the rounds left the muzzle of the tank's cannon, releasing 1,281 steel pellets. The pellets moved downrange in a conical pattern, acting like a shotgun blast. The canister round was capable of inflicting casualties in an area 33 yards wide and 202 yards deep. You would not want to be standing in front of that. Its heavy use led to the improved beehive round for the M41 90mm on the Patton series tanks, designated the anti-personnel tracer, which contained 4,100 small flechettes and was even more deadly in the VC than you can see there, they look like little arrows, the little needles, and they could do a lot of damage. Next slide, please. And you can see how some of the other tanks were deployed. Other types of operations American Patton tanks took part in during the Vietnam War included clear and hold, which was aimed at driving enemy forces out of designated areas and keeping them out. It was also something referred to as security. Security operations for armored units included route security and convoy escort. You can see the picture there with the I apologize for this.
Hey, Bill. Why don't we take a little break,
okay,
and you relax and have a drink?
All right, let me have a drink of my ginger ale, and I'll be right with you.
Go ahead.
Okay, as you can see, we're back now. As you can see there in the picture, you have a tank going down to one of the roads. Most of the roads were dirt, and they got wheels in front of it. That would be setting off the tanks. I mean, setting off the landmines and so forth. That was before the convoys would go down the roads. And some places like that, it would go down the road that morning before the convoy started and explode. Any landmines were put out there. Then you can see down there, some of the tanks also had a blade put on. I think that was part of the Rome plow blade there, but that was put on the front of the tank where they could scrape the road. It was also good for getting through heavy vegetation and so forth. So that's some of the different ways there it was used, and for convoy escort. Now, route security required a large armored force for the entire time of a planned convoy mission. In other words, if you had a convoy and you needed tanks to stay right there with the convoy most of the time. Bridges and other critical points first had to be secured with mobile tank-heavy outposts. These also were tank-heavy patrol actions nicknamed Roadrunner Operations. In other words, tanks would set up and be the guards at the bridges and so forth, which would be very vulnerable to be blown up so that the convoys couldn't go off. Roadrunner operations conducted at random times and in varying directions between the mobile outposts to fend off attempts by enemy forces to lay an ambush. To deter the enemy from laying mines during the darkness of night, some Patton tank units conducted Roadrunner operations at night, firing their tanks' machine guns and canister main gun rounds to both sides of the planned convoy route at regular intervals to disrupt any enemy plans at laying ambush. In other words, they couldn't see anybody, but they would be going down and they'd be firing those canister rounds and the machine guns so that if there's anybody there anywhere close by to be setting mines and so forth, there was a good chance they would get them. It also made it very hard for the communists to go in and set the mines because they never know when they were going to be firing in what direction and so forth. So you can see them coming down on a convoy. Now, as a convoy, how would you like to be driving one of those fuel trucks down a convoy with a convoy as far as you can see right there, with bad guys out there who want to blow you up with mines or just shoot the trucks? Convoy escort missions required a much smaller force of Patton tanks, and that only for the time needed to move the convoy from one point to another. In some cases, a combination of route security and convoy escort operations were deployed to safely move convoys through enemy-infested areas. But the important thing was to keep the supplies moving so that the troops, wherever they were in combat, had whatever they needed. So, okay, next slide. It was not uncommon practice during the Vietnam War to open convoy routes each day by driving Patton tanks over them before permitting other vehicles to use the local road network. We talked about that, and you can see 2 tanks coming down the road. Due to the thick, elliptical shaped hull of the vehicle, it was normally able to absorb the shock of most mine explosions with only light to moderate damage. But as everything else we did, the Viet Cong soon learned ways to get around it. So, however, the VC and NVA would on occasion use much larger than normal charges at improvised mines that could cause extensive damage to the Patton tanks and kill the crews that served upon them. In other words, if it was a bombing mission and some of the 750-pound, 500-pound bombs didn't explode for whatever reason, they could get those, put them in the road. And even though the tank had a lot of armor, when they run over it, there was a good chance that the tank was going to be destroyed and the crew was either killed or injured bad. Okay. Mines were the most widely used weapon employed by the VC and NVA forces against American and Allied tanks. Other tank-killing weapons employed by the enemy included a crew-served 57mm and 75mm recoilless rifle, as you can see that thing on the little stand there, as well as man-portable shoulder-launched rockets-propelled grenade launchers, RPGs. And I think all the enemy guys today have RPGs. The VC and NVA originally used the Soviet-designed RPG-2 until it was in turn replaced by the longer range and more effective RPG-7, which fired a roughly 5-pound rocket with a shaped charge warhead out to 547 yards, which is basically 5 telephone poles, which could penetrate approximately 260mm steel armor. That's a pretty good rocket, but that's what the communists could carry around so much. The recoilless rifle was a little harder to carry, but they did. Now, as you can see, there were problems operating tanks in Vietnam. As you can see the picture there on the left, the young man is standing there watching him trying to get that tank out of the mud, and the one behind it's not going to help because he's kind of stuck too. And as you can see in the big picture there, the tank is they're trying to bring in some rock or some logs and so forth to get up under the tank. During the monsoon seasons, you did not want to get tanks off the road too much. The last remaining American military-operated tank unit departed Southeast Asia in April of 1972. So the tanks did a great job, but they did have problems. As you can see the picture there, if you look out to the back of the tank, you can see the treads have come off. So they're trying to fix the treads. And the bottom right-hand picture, you see that the tread is back up on the hill there. They've gone down to the river, going to cross the river, but the tread's off. So now they got to go get the tread and get somebody to put the tread back on. So you had the problems with getting stuck. You had the problems with the tread coming off. And this is some of the different tank configurations. You can see the guys there got himself an umbrella, keep himself out of the sun. Let's see if I can get a little closer here. Looks like that's an anti-aircraft gun mounted on the top there. I can see 2 barrels. You see the flamethrower, and you see the M50 Antos tank destroyer with all those, which was actually a anti-aircraft gun too, and it's got 3, 6, .36 barrels on it. You see the short-nosed tank, and then you see some guys standing there. Everything we had just about was decorated. That one looks like, can't tell what exactly who that person was on that decoration. But anyway, that kind of gives you some of the ideas of some of the tanks that were available and so forth. Another one was the Sheridan light tank, M55 51. There's the Patton tank again we talked about. There's a tank trying to pull another tank out of being kind of stuck a little bit, and then the tank's behind. And there's a guy riding on the barrel of one of the tanks. Again, what you can see that headlight or that spotlight behind him there, and those things were bright. And like I said, you could really see the enemy, but the enemy could sure see where you were too, because it's kind of like tracers. The tracers know where your bullets are hitting, but you also know where they're coming from. There's some more among the weapons left behind by the American military to aid the Army Republic of Vietnam, which was the South Vietnamese, was a battalion's worth of Patton tanks, which were used to form the 20th Tank Regiment. Their primary tank of the Army since 1965 had been the American-supplied Walker Bulldog light tank, armed with 76mm main guns. One of the reasons that was used mostly by the Army's, it was originally a tank for Americans, but it was a little small inside, and it just seemed to fit the small in stature of South Vietnamese soldiers, and they really liked them. But that's the Walker Bulldog tank, okay? The Sheridan light tank. In April of 1965, the Army awarded a 4-year contract to the Cadillac Gauge Division of the General Motors Corporation for the production of the M109 howitzer and the XM551 General Sheridan. In February, 2 squadrons totaling 54 Sheridans were operated in South Vietnam. Despite indications by May of 1966 that the tank's caseless ammunition was prone to cooking off. In other words, it would explode earlier before, but whether you were shot in the barrel, it would be inside the tank and would cook off or explode. The problem was resolved by a compressed air system that forced air on the ammunition residue from the breech. In other words, it would get the hot shell out of the breech so they wouldn't cook off the other ones and so forth. The Sheridan had several different problems. A congressional report attributed several Vietnam War casualties to the Sheridan design's faults and said the tank had been wholly unready for combat in Vietnam without extensive and costly retrofits. Now, if you remember, they did the same thing with M16. It was sent there and had lots of different design faults off to start with until Congress got involved. The vehicle designed to mount the gun had a steel turret and aluminum hull. Although the hull could defeat heavy machine gun fire of up to 12.7mm, it was easily defeated by rocket-propelled grenades, which could destroy the vehicle if the shrapnel contacted the caseless main gun rounds. Again, we got that caseless main gun rounds. Now, when I say caseless, you usually think of the brass body around the shell where the power is. When it goes off, the brass is still there. These particular rounds didn't have that case. Like the M113 armored personnel carrier, it was also vulnerable to landmines. In other words, the armor on the bottom was thin, and if it ran over landmines, it had a problem. The Sheridan also had several advantages. It did not get stuck in the mud as often as the Patton tank, because the Patton tank was 52 tons, nor did it throw its track off as often. This alone was enough to win the tank crew's favor, because if it was stuck or the track was coming off, it wasn't much good for anybody, okay? The lightweight and high mobility proved the Sheridan's worth, and the gun proved an effective anti-personnel weapon when used with either the M657 high explosive shell or the M625 canister round, which used thousands of flechettes as projectiles. So it had problems, but it had good parts too, just like all the other tanks. The reliability of the engine system and gun of the tank, however, not fully up to task. Of 74 Sheridan's M551 sent to Vietnam in February of 1969, by May, they recorded 16 serious mechanical faults, 41 failed shots, 140 defective ammunitions, and 25 burned out engines. The turret itself had 125 electrical faults, several recoil system faults, and an instance of blown up guns. An additional problem, much of the carried machine gun ammunition had to be stored outside the turret as the internal space was extremely limited. So they won't run for the bullets. You had to leave them outside, which also made them very vulnerable. In 1969, evaluation of the vehicles found that the M551 Sheridan was employed in reconnaissance and night patrols and road clearing, accumulating 39,455 road miles and 520 combat missions. Despite vulnerability to rockets and mines, it was judged worthy of applying modifications and equipping all cavalry squadrons with the Sheridan. It sucked, but it didn't suck so bad that it didn't do a good job. The Sheridan was much appreciated by the infantry, who were desperate for direct fire support. And those big heavy tanks couldn't go where the infantry need them sometimes, but the lightweight Sherman could. As you can see, one of them right there at the bottom. Sheridan losses were heavy during normal operations, larger due to landmines and anti-armor weapons. And that's what one looks like it when it got broke. Okay, next slide. The M41 Walker Bulldog. Initially, it was nicknamed Little Bulldog, then renamed to Walker Bulldog after General Walton Walker, who was killed in a Jeep accident in Korea in 1950. Now, just looking at the picture, for those of us who are not real big on tanks, so forth, they don't look like there's a whole lot of difference. I'm just counting the wheels. I think there's a little difference in the wheels there, but this one's a little smaller. The first Walker Bulldog M41A3s arrived in January 1965, equipping 5 armored squadrons by the end of the year. The Walker Bulldog was an instant success with South Vietnamese armor crew, who found the M41's interior to be just perfect for their stature, which been a principal criticism by the United States Army armor crew when they had been inside to the vehicle. Okay. Next slide, please. Okay, in 1971, the Army and U.S. forces commenced Operation Lam Sam 719, a disruptive of communist supply lines in neighboring Laos. A combination of armor and air mobile attacks in 3 areas into the enemy-held territory. The 1st Armored Brigade, accompanied by 2 airborne battalions and 2 cavalry regiments, penetrated approximately 4 miles into Laos on 8th of February. In reaction was swift and violent. With this first engagement between NVA and Patton Tanks, the 17 Walker Bulldog M41 destroyed 22 communist tanks, 6 T-54s, and 16 P-76s at no loss for themselves. So all the things you've heard about the Patton soldiers not being good soldiers, not only were they good soldiers there, but they had a superior tank. Now, the A41 Tyrion Mk13 main battle tank, this was actually built by the British at the end of World War II, but was used by the Australian Army in the Vietnam War, had a crew of 4. It weighed 51 tons, just a little bit lighter than, but not much, than the Patton. The length was 25 feet, height is 9, width was 11 feet tall. The weapon's main 4.3, 13-inch secondary was 1 coaxial 7.62 machine gun and 1 coaxial 7.62 machine gun in the commander's cupola. So as you can see in the front there, they had those little barrels sticking out, the 7.62s, and then up there where you see the flag and the soldier sticking out. I do not see it on that one, but normally it was a 7.62 machine gun. Armor was 5.98 inches. The engine was a Rolls-Royce 12-cylinder. 650 horsepower, 21 miles per hour. 650 horsepower, that's a lot of horsepower. And Get that out of the way there. Okay, next slide. With the departure of American ground forces from Southeast Asia, the emboldened military and political senior leadership in North Vietnam mounted a massive offensive operation against South Vietnam on the Easter weekend of 1972. That was the Easter invasion. After the American soldiers started pulling out, the North Vietnam communists would do little things just to see if they could get the American people to come back, forces to come back in, and we didn't come back in, so they kept right on getting a little bolder each time. Leading the way of the NVA operation up to 600 tanks, including Soviet-supplied T-54s, medium tanks armed with a 100-millimeter main gun, and that's one of the Russian tanks coming in. As you can see on the back, there's a barrel back there of fuel for the tank, which was one of their vulnerabilities of that extra tank there would be the first thing you want to shoot for. So, okay, that's next slide. However, American air power assets in the region helped blunt the NVA offensive along with a surprisingly strong showing by many ARVN units. The ARVN 20th Tank Regiment took a heavy toll of NVA tanks during the spring invasion. During a single engagement along National Highway 9 on 9 April 1972, the M48 A3 tank, which was a Patton, of the ARVN 20th Tank Regiment, destroyed 16 T-54 tanks and captured a Chinese-built copy of the T-54 tank, designated the Type 59. As you can see, the USR T-59 tank, which actually was built by they took a 54 Russian T-54 tank and built their own version of it and called it Type 59. And if it's like everything else the Chinese made, it probably broke down a lot. But the top picture is the Russian, and the bottom picture is the Chinese tank. Next slide. North Vietnamese tank. A T-54 and T-55 main battle tanks had been amongst the most widely used tanks in the world. The USSR supplied the North Vietnamese Army and the Viet Cong with T-54 and T-55 tanks during the Vietnam War. In 1947, the Soviets built the first prototype of the T-54 main battle tank. This was based on the T-44 medium tank, a tank that had entered service towards the end of World War II. The T-54 entered service in 1950. And you see on the back there that how they predominantly, that barrel of fuel, extra fuel sticks up and so forth, and so forth. Next slide, please. It is powered by a 520 horsepower V12 diesel engine. A 4-man crew operated the T-54, a driver, a commander, a gunner, and a loader. The driver sits at the front of the hull on the right side. The commander and the gunner sit on the left side of the turret, and the loader sits in the turret on the right. Main armament on the T-54 is a 100-millimeter gun. Secondary armament includes a 0.3-inch, 7.62 millimeter coaxial machine gun and a 7.62 machine gun in the bow, which the driver operates. A 12.7 millimeter anti-aircraft gun that is mounted on the loader's hatch. So that one even had an anti-aircraft gun on it. The T-54 can lay a smoke green by injecting diesel fuel into the exhaust out on the left of the hull. In other words, it wanted to hide so it couldn't be seen by the airplanes. All they had to do was put some fuel into that exhaust, and it would blow out smoke. With the aid of a snorkel, the T-54 could ford bodies of water up to 18 feet deep. In other words, so they could see where they were going, they had to have a snorkel because it would be over top of the tank some. Okay, next slide. North Vietnamese tank. The P-76 light amphibious tank is a fully amphibious tank that was developed in the Soviet Union after World War II. It has been used by countries all over the world, still is. During the Vietnam War, the North Vietnamese Army, the NVA, used the PT-76. It could easily travel through rice paddies and traverse bridges that were not sturdy enough for heavier tanks. And it would basically, it would go across, it would swim to a certain extent. It had exhaust on it to do that. The P-76 was involved in the only tank versus tank battle between the U.S. Army during the Vietnam War. As we mentioned before, the Battle of Ben Het in 1969, when 10 North Vietnamese P-76's light amphibious tanks faced several American Patton tanks. The P-76 is fully amphibious tank. It can travel through water without special preparation. Before the tank enters the water, a trim vane is erected in front of the tank. The driver's center periscope is raised so he can see above the trim vane. Bilge pumps are turned on so the tank will remain afloat if it is hit. The tank has 2 water jets, one on each side of the hull. Their exits are in the rear of the tank. Water is drawn into the vents in the tank and tank's belly and pressurized and expelled through the vents in the rear of the tank. And that's how they get about. That's the power, was the almost like jet engines there. Okay, next slide. The North Vietnamese tank, Type 59, main battle tank, was the most common tank of the People's Liberation Army of China. It is based on the Soviet Union's T-54 main battle tank. In the early 1950s, the Soviet Union gave China some T-54 tanks. The Chinese used a design to create their own tank with Chinese parts. This became the Type 59 main battle tank. Okay, next slide. The first version of T-59 had armor that was relatively thin with comparison to T-54. Like a T-54, the Type 59 had a 4-man crew. However, in the Type 59, the driver sits at the front of the hull on the left rather than on the right. Some ammunition is stored on the driver's right. The commander, gunner, and loader sit in the turret. The commander and gunner on the left and loader on the right. If you can see in the pictures there, you can see the commander where the antennas are, and then the loader or the machine gunner to the left there. The Type 59 MBT has a loader's cupola as well as a commander's cupola, as you can see there in the pictures, okay? This is the North Vietnamese tank also. The Type 63 light amphibious tank was used by the North Vietnamese during the Vietnam War. Although it had excellent mobility, its thin armor made it very vulnerable to anti-tank weapons. They ain't much good if they don't stop a bullet, will they? Armor on the T-63 light amphibious tank is relatively thin. Maximum armor thickness is 0.55 inches, a little over a ½ inch there. The Type 63 light amphibious tank is more heavily armed than the P-76. Armor on the Type 63 light amphibious tank consists of a 3.35-inch main gun, a 0.3-inch coaxial machine gun, and a 0.5-inch anti-aircraft gun that is mounted on the roof of the turret. The Type 63 is operated by a 4-man crew, a driver, a commander, a gunner, and a loader. Having a separate gunner and loader is supposedly to enable the crew to operate the tank more efficiently. The Type 63 uses hydrojet propulsion to move through the water, very similar to the other tank we just talked about. Each tank has 2 water jets, one on each side of the hull. When water enters the tank and pressurized, it is expelled. Okay, next slide. There's some of the other track vehicles of the Vietnam War. There's a bridge on a set of tracks. That is awesome to see one of those in operation. The big picture right there is we didn't buy those. We actually leased those from another country. It was called a jungle crusher. You can see the two big wheels with the contraption in the front and the wheel in the back. But if you look right behind that last one big wheel there, how the ground is tore up, it's almost impossible to walk on that. Plus the fact that the trees are all ground up. It may have cleared the jungle pretty good, but it sure made it hard to get through it. And you can see there's another tank we left in Vietnam. Was another explosive tank. I think that one is at Quai Son. I think I remember taking that picture with that one in Quai Son. And this is the one you see everywhere over there. This is how I got around sometimes when I was out. This is the M1132 Army Personnel Carrier, APC. Its height was 8 feet. Its width was 8 feet. The length was 15 feet. Had a crew of 1. Well, Most of them had more than that, and it carried 12 troops. Now that was carrying 12 troops inside. I don't remember seeing many people riding inside. Most of us rode on top. So let's see, that kind of gives you an idea. There's one right there. You can see some of the inside. There's one. M14113 is a fully tracked armored personnel carrier manufactured by BAT Systems. The vehicle was first fielded by the United States Army's mechanized infantry units in Vietnam in April 1962. Early on, the M113 was the most widely used armored vehicle of the United States Army in the Vietnam War. They were everywhere, earning the nickname Green Dragon by the Viet Cong. It was used to break through heavy thickets in the midst of the jungle to attack and overrun enemy positions, but largely known as an APC, Armored Cavalry Assault Vehicle by the Allied Forces. They were real good for going through elephant grass, but what you had to watch out, if been a bombing run through there, 500-pound bombs or so, and some of those big bomb craters, and you're riding through the jungle or you're riding through the elephant grass, you could drive right off in a hole if you weren't real careful. The M113, or Armored Personnel Carrier, introduced a new aluminum armor that made the vehicle much lighter than early vehicles. It was thick enough to protect the crew and passengers against small arms fire, but light enough that the vehicle was air transportable and moderately amphibious. Moderately, I think was the word. And they did move around quite a bit by helicopters and so forth. The M113, or APC, was developed to provide a survivable and reliable light tracked vehicle able to be airlifted and airdropped by a C-130 and a C-141 transport planes. In other words, you hook a couple parachutes up to it and kick it out. The original concept was that the vehicle would be used solely for transportation, bringing the troops forward under armor and then having them dismount for combat, and the APC would then retreat to the rear. That didn't last very long. As you can saw from that picture, everybody rode up on top, and it didn't go to the rear much. Now, here's some different configurations of the armored personnel carrier. You can see that one with the looks like it might be a flamethrower gun there, and then you see one with a pretty good size armament. There's one that's used exclusively for a ambulance, and then there's a command post armored personnel carrier. They had all kinds of different configurations on them. There's one there. You can see they tied wheels to the side. They could go down the road and help clear mines. That's the driver. You see one with this writing on it, standing order for. You can see the 50 caliber machine gun there, and the driver to the left. The one at the bottom looks like it has an anti-aircraft gun on it. The one with in the middle there has got a pretty good sized gun with another machine gun on it. And I never remember seeing one with the extra gun mount like the one on the right has, but that's some of the different configurations. There were all kinds of different stuff. Now, this is a strange looking thing. The Antos self-propelled M50. It mounted 6 106 millimeter manual loaded M41 recordless rifles as its main armament, which could be fired in rapid succession against single targets to guarantee a kill. It was produced in limited numbers for the U.S. Marines after the U.S. Army canceled the project. The Marines consistently reported excellent results when they used the Antos for direct fire support against infantry in numerous battles in operation during the Vietnam War. The American stock of Antos was largely expended towards the end of the conflict, and Antos was removed from service in 1969. That was before the war was even over with. We hadn't even left there, but had gotten rid of them. The Duster, the M42 self-propelled anti-aircraft gun, as you can see there, it looked kind of like an armored personnel carrier, not an APC, with an extra turret and so forth there. The Viet Cong called them the Fire Dragons because their high volume of fire and tracer ammunition gave the appearance of a dragon's breath. The U.S. Army crews called them Dusters due to the large clouds of dust they created as they sped across the dirt roads of Vietnam. The M42's armored chassis was the same as that being used by the M41 Walker Bulldog light tank that the Vietnamese were using. The chassis and turrets were constructed of all welded, rolled, and cast homogeneous steel with armored thickness ranging from 0.3 to 1.25 inches. The M42 was 19 feet 1 inches in length. Overall length, including guns, was 20 feet 10 inches. The M42's width was 10 feet 7 inches. It stood 9 feet 4 inches in height. The vehicle's combat weight was 49,500 pounds. A Continental 6-cylinder, 4-cycle opposed air-cooled supercharged gasoline engine served the vehicle's power plant. This gave the M42 a maximum road speed of 45 miles an hour and a 140-gallon fuel tank, allowing for a cruising range of 100 miles. The M42 was designed to carry a crew of 6. Although a 4-man crew was normal in actual combat conditions, the crew was composed of the commander, radio operator, seated in the hull right front, driver, hull left front, gun turret left, and sight setter was the turret on the right, and 2 loaders. So that was how that was set up. Now the M1132 or M67 Zippo, you can see the armored personnel carrier there with the Zippo on it. One of the less well-known variants of the M113 was the self-propelled flamethrower M132. In service in 1963, the M132, along with the flamethrower tank M67 Zippo, and you know the word Zippo came from because of Zippo lighters. One had nothing to do with the other, but they were both lighters in their own way, would be one of the most last armored or mechanized flamethrowers to see service in the United States military. Whereas the M67 was served in the U.S. Marine Corps, the M1132 which served with the U.S. Army. The vehicle saw action during the long years of the Vietnam War from 1955 to 1975, but its time in service was, however, short-lived. This is mostly due to the fact that after Vietnam, flamethrowing vehicles began to fall out of favor. But did a great job there. Now, this is a strange-looking animal. The LVTP-5, Landing Vehicle Tracked Personnel Amphibious Armored Personnel Carrier. And I never saw one of those because I was down in the South, and this was mostly with the Marines. The LTVP portion of the designation stemmed from Landing Vehicle Tracked Personnel, which aptly describes the nature of the LVTP-5. Perform its intended mission, that of putting Marines onto the beach, when weighing in at 64,200 pounds. The massive vehicle was powered by an 810 horsepower Continental V12 engine that gave it a land speed of 30 miles per hour and up to 6.8 miles per hour in the water. Ashore, the LVTP had a range of 190 miles, and in water it was 57 miles. It was somewhat, it was kind of an overgrown armored personnel carrier the Navy had for running the Marines and so forth, but it was just kind of strange. Look at all those wheels on the ground there. And it was big. Next picture. And you can see the inside there, how it opens up. With a 3-man crew, it was designed to carry 34 troops in the hull. But in practice, the normal maximum was about 25 Marines with all their combat equipment. The vehicle's armor topped out at 0.6 of an inch thick, and a cupola on top mounted a 30 caliber machine gun. Okay, but that's okay, next slide. There it is again with a configuration on the front. Variants to the troop carrying model included an LVTH-6, the H standing for
howitzer.
Howitzer, yeah, I couldn't see from my picture was there. Howitzer mounted on an M41 105 howitzer in a turret atop the hull. Up to 150 rounds of ammunition could be carried on board on land. But when it was waterborne, no more than 100 rounds were stowed to keep the vehicle balanced. Another version of the LVTC, a command vehicle for headquarters elements. A recovery and repair vehicle was using the same hull, was called the LVTR-1. I don't know where they kept up with all these numbers. It was a recovery vehicle. An engineered vehicle, the LVTE, weighed 82,750 pounds and could be fitted with a bulldozer blade. That's a strange looking bulldozer blade. The dozer blade also had a rake-like device for use in mine clearing, and on its roof was mounted a rocket-propelled demolition charge. The rocket could be launched against a suspected minefield, trading a line charge of explosive. Once laid across the minefield, the line charge detonated, clearing the path.
Bill, how many more slides are there?
Let's see. We're getting close to the end, but we're running out of time.
Yeah.
Tell you what, we'll just pick it up the next time, Amnon. Let me just make a couple announcements real quick. Coming up, I know we got to stay separated out there a little bit, but the 10th is Mother's Day. Even if you can't go see her, you can give her a call or call her and tell her how to use Zoom or somebody like that, and you can talk to her face-to-face or FaceTime or whatever you want to. But just don't forget your mother on the 10th. Our next show will be April 13th. We will continue the end of this series of the tanks and so forth. We're just about to the end, but I don't want to hold you up, so we'll continue that and start our next show. Working on a guest for the show. So wherever you are out there, stay safe, be careful, follow the rules, get out and walk around a little bit, get outside the house. There's all kinds of things you can do. Work on your yard, plant some flowers, whatever, but stay out there and stay safe. We're almost over this virus stuff, and let's don't get right down to the end and do things crazy before we're supposed to. So God bless you all and be safe, and we'll see you next show. Good evening and happy Mother's Day.
You are tuned to the Nissan Communications Network. If you tuned in too late, you can always watch each program in its entirety or download an MP3 audio file of it in the archives section at nissancommunications.com. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on Twitter, and like us on Facebook. Sponsored by Telestream's Wirecast software, StreamingGear.com, Carolina Apparel, and DeltaForce.net.